Now, if you'll get the hymnal out, you'll need it this morning for this one because this is probably somewhat unfamiliar, but it's Safely Through Another Week, page 6. Safely Through Another Week, page 6. Great text. We will not use it all, of course, just verse 1. And look down on the bottom line. You'll see near the end of the line those speckled-looking notes with lots of bars on them there. Those are called 16th notes. They're faster. Just do the best you can. We're not going to hurry with it, but this is a wonderful text. Just one verse. Safely through another week. Sing it, please. Safely through another week, God has brought us on our way. Let us now a blessing seek, waiting in His courts today. Day of all the week the best, emblem of eternal rest. Day of all the week the best, emblem of eternal rest. Let's do that bottom line again. Let's do the bottom line again. Here we go. Day of all the week the best, emblem of eternal rest. That's better, about a B plus. One more time and we'll have it on the bottom line. Day of all the week the best, emblem of eternal rest. And don't you feel that way about Sunday? Day of all the best. I love it.
Having to go over that last line 2 or 3 times reminds me of another trick I learned from Dr. Scoville years ago. If it doesn't come out exactly the way you wanted, just look at your neighbor like they did it. And yeah, that has worked for me a few times, I think. So anyway, good morning to you. Yeah, that's it. That's about the way it is, isn't it? So hopefully we'll get you warmed up by the time that Pastor gets in here for our regular service. So we always like to open our Sunday school hour by remembering our missionaries that are based out of, sent out of our church here at Maranatha. That would include the Lockhart family, with Jeremy's the director at Worldwide Mission in Kings Mountain, and continue to pray that God will bless his work and his meetings and such. And coming up in about a month, they have their annual meeting with all of their missionary families and their board pastors and such, but all the missionaries that are stateside at the time. And so that's a big responsibility, but just pray for all of that to come together. The Maetas in Italy, they still have some restrictions and limitations and stuff like that. So pray that God will allow them to get things restarted with the COVID restrictions, and also they have some refugees from Ukraine direction coming that way. So if you remember, both Brother Maeta and the other missionary that we supported there in Italy for a long time, whose name just left me, he retired, Larry Pieri. He retired about a year ago. But there were already refugee camps there in Italy where they had some ministry, and Brother Pieri had a lot of, but a lot of those were not necessarily from the east, but from Russia, from Africa direction. But do continue to pray for the ways in which that enhances the Maeta's ability to minister there. Pray for the Ibans as they are trying to schedule meetings, visit all their supporting churches, and trying to determine the best course of treatment and action for Susan's heart situation. I know they'd appreciate our prayers on both of those. And then Jed and Gloria in Brazil, they are having services with their church plant. And, there's a couple of families that are coming. There's one family that Jed does not believe are saved, that promised to come. So he asked us to pray about that, pray for their salvation. Let me see here. I have the names here. Give me just a second. He asked us to pray for Ricardo and Erica for their salvation. And there's a couple of other families, but those in particular. And so we want to remember their work there as they're getting church plant started. And we sometimes kind of fast forward or skip to the highlights. We think, oh yeah, okay. We see the pictures on the prayer letters, and not necessarily the steps that it takes to get there with visiting and talking to people and win them to the Lord and getting them to come on Sunday and all of those things. Just pray that God will encourage them and continue to bless that ministry. All right, any other urgent requests this morning as we go to prayer? All right, Doc Scoville, would you open us in prayer this morning, please? Amen. All right, we are in 1 Kings, chapter 9 is where we're going to pick up this morning. What I have on the screen here is where we left off last week at the end of chapter 8. We've talked about the building of the temple, Solomon's building of the temple, and then we talked about the dedication. There were 3 major feast times in the Mosaic law in the life of Israel. There was one at the beginning of their year, which would be our springtime, which we call Easter, but it was Passover. It was unleavened bread, Passover, and first fruits were all right there together. And then in the middle of their year was Pentecost, which was 50 days later, which was a harvest festival. And then you had the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. But the dedication of the temple was connected with the Feast of Tabernacles at the end of their calendar year. And it looks, best I can tell, it looks like Solomon had, an extra feast time before the actual official week of the Feast of Tabernacles, so because it was 14 days altogether that they celebrated. And we talked about, as we were ending up, how he had added extra altars in the courtyard and in different places to help accommodate all the sacrifices. But the total between Solomon's offerings and the offerings of the people, the total was about 1,500 some oxen per day, 8,500 sheep per day. This was a huge feast, a huge celebration. Now, if you notice verse 66 of chapter 8, right at the end, on the 8th day, well, back up 65. At that time Solomon held a feast, and all Israel with him, a great congregation, from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of Egypt before the Lord our God. Hamath was on the northern borders of Israel. The river of Egypt is not necessarily the Nile. Could possibly be, but could also refer to another river that was on the southern border between Israel and Egypt's territory. But anyway, the point is that the entire country, northern border to southern border, was involved in this. 7 and 7, even 14 days. Verse 66, on the 8th day he sent the people away, and they blessed the king and went unto their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had done for David his servant and for Israel his people. So you had this massive celebration. It was a dedication time for the temple. The temple was, the construction was begun during what year of Solomon's reign? I'm not asking for a date necessarily, just a number. Anybody remember? 1 Kings 6:1 tells us it was the 4th year of Solomon's reign when he began to build the temple. So 7 years would put it in the 11th year. And then I think the dedication happened the next year in the 12th year of Solomon. That is significant because of what we're getting ready to talk about here in chapter 9. Verse 1, it came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all Solomon's desire which he was pleased to do. All right. The parallel passage to this is 2 Chronicles chapter 7. And if you want to go ahead and put a finger over there or a bookmark or something, we're going to turn back and forth a little bit today between 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Okay? 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 10. 7:10, on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away in their tents, glad and merry in heart for the goodness the Lord had showed unto David and to Solomon. Verse 11, thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all that came into Solomon's heart to make in the house of the Lord, and in his own house he prosperously effected. So, the dedication of the temple was a big event, and then some other things were just kind of summarized. They're going to be discussed a little bit more further down in chapter 9 of 1 Kings. But what we see here is that it says Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house and everything else he was working on. Okay? So what we're going to see next, where God appears to Solomon the second time, that doesn't necessarily happen the day after Solomon sent everybody home. Okay? In 1 Kings chapter 9, it says, when he had finished the building of the house of the Lord and the king's house and all his desire. Well, if you drop down to 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse number 10 with me, 1 Kings 9 and verse 10, it came to pass at the end of 20 years when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. So, chapter 9 verse 1, when he talks about building the house of the Lord and the king's house, how long did that take altogether? 20 years. It was 13 years on his house, 7 years on the Lord's house. But the historians, the Bible historians, their writing perspective was more of what we would call an Eastern mindset. I don't know if any of you have ever studied Eastern cultures or Eastern languages, but a lot of the Eastern ways of communication are different. I still remember when I was in elementary school, we had missions conference. Our Christian school was part of our church. At a missions conference, and one of the missionaries came in and did a Christian school chapel with us. Or it may have just come to our class, I don't remember. But anyway, our Christian school principal was there. And the missionary challenged our Christian school principal to see who could write John 3:16 the fastest. Now, the missionary was either in Japan or Korea. But, it was more what we would think of as symbols instead of letters for their system of writing. So they both went to the chalkboard. Yes, I know I don't look that old, but I am. Went to the chalkboard and began to write. And I still remember, the missionary wrote top to bottom and right to left. From your perspective, it would be like this, okay? And done. And our Christian school principal wasn't writing neatly. He would have been graded down on his penmanship, but he was in a hurry. It wasn't halfway through the verse writing it out in English. That was kind of my first exposure to that. But what I'm saying is their letters and words many times are more like symbols. It's right to left. It's just a different way of thinking. The Eastern mindset is often more picturesque, more emotions, and they don't do it the same way we would do. We operate out of a Western mindset. So for me, it makes a lot more sense to go A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 1000 BC, 999, 998, 997, 996. The Jewish writers, which, that was more of an Eastern mindset, they would tend to follow one line of thought till they got it completed, and then they'd back up and do something else. So when you get into Kings and Chronicles especially, they'll follow one king all the way to the end, which may cover 20 years. Then they'll back up 14 years and get the other king that had started and ruled at the same time. You have a little bit of that here in chapter 9 is what I'm saying, because verses 1 and 2 are a summary. And then when you pick up in verses 10 through 19, it gives more details about what was built. But we tend to think, okay, boom, boom, boom. The temple was built, and then the next day God appeared to Solomon in a dream. It was actually, I think, somewhere around the midpoint. Anybody remember how long Solomon was king over Israel? Say it louder. 40 years, that's correct. So if this happened 20 years in, then this is approximately the midpoint, right? About halfway through Solomon's reign, which makes sense, which, some dots we'll try to connect here as we go through. But in our passage, this second time God appears to Solomon comes right after the story of dedication of the temple. But I do think there was some time that has passed between the dedication of the temple and this second appearance to Solomon, okay? Verse number 2, the Lord appeared to Solomon the second time as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. And when the Lord appeared to Solomon in Gibeon, do you remember how he appeared to him? Anybody? That was when he appeared to him and said, ask anything you want. What was it? I heard somebody say it. It was in a dream. Yeah. So God appeared to him apparently the same way in a dream. Verse 3, the Lord said unto him, I have heard thy prayer and thy supplication that thou hast made before me. I have hallowed this house which thou hast built to put my name there forever, and mine eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. Now that'd be pretty neat if God showed up and said verbally, I've heard your prayer and I will answer your request. That'd be pretty neat, wouldn't it? Okay. But God started out that way. But then the rest of God's message to Solomon, I think, fits more in a timeline with that 20-year mark, kind of that halfway down the road. Verse number 4, if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart, in uprightness, to do according to all that I've commanded thee, and wilt keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of thy kingdom upon Israel forever. As I promised to David thy father, saying, there shall not fail thee a man upon the throne of Israel. But if ye shall turn at all from following me, ye or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them, and this house which I have hallowed for my name will I cast off out of my sight. And Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And at this house which is high, every one that passeth by it shall be astonished, and shall hiss, and shall say, why hath the Lord done thus unto this land and to this house? And they shall answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought forth their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have taken hold upon other gods, and have worshipped them and served them. Therefore hath the Lord brought upon them all this evil. So the first two verses we see God saying, I've heard your prayer, Solomon, and I'm going to answer your request. What was the main gist of the rest of God's message to Solomon? Sounds like a warning, doesn't it? Okay, I don't know how necessary that was in the 6 months after the building of the temple or the dedication of the temple. Maybe, maybe not. But let's just talk about human nature for a minute. When are we most likely to be tempted to turn away from God to other things? When life is difficult and hard and we really need help? Or when life's good and things are going smoothly and we have the blessings and we have time and a measure of prosperity? Which one is more of a temptation to turn away from the Lord? Yeah, when life is good, that's when it's easier to turn away from the Lord. Okay? So when Solomon was trying to build the temple and trying to get things established and he's got all these projects going on, he's trying to work on it, that was a time when it was maybe a little easier to stay on track or stay focused. But what happened over Solomon's time? Remember, God said, because you didn't ask for it, but you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you what? Riches, fame, wisdom, all of these things. So then over time, he begins to accumulate all of those things. And it was at that point when Solomon begins to accumulate fame and wealth. And if I could say it this way, he's got a lot of money and a lot of time on his hands. What happens to professional athletes who have a lot of money and a lot of time on their hands? Yeah, they get in trouble. Exactly. What happens to but that tends to be a bad combination, right? A lot of money and a lot of time on your hands tends to be trouble. And it makes a lot of sense to me, just following human nature even, as well as following this timeline, that at that 20-year mark, Solomon's getting established. He's got wealth established. He's got people bringing him tribute and gifts and those kind of things. That would be even more of a temptation point to kind of drift away from the Lord. And specifically, notice what was the admonition in verse number 6? What was the specific sin God warned them about? Read a little bit further. It said, if you won't keep my statutes, but if you do what? Serve other gods. Okay, in verse 9, in a prophetic way, he says, later on, people are going to come by and say, why did God allow this to be destroyed? And he says, because they served other gods. So idolatry has always been a temptation for Israel from the beginning of their existence. I mean, who was the favorite wife of Jacob, later named Israel? Who was his favorite wife? Rachel. What did she steal from her father when they were on the way out? His idols, his gods. Yeah. I mean, and you follow that all the way down through. That was always a temptation. How long was Israel out of Egypt after God brought the plagues and brought them out of Egypt? How long were they out of Egypt and in the wilderness before they had built an idol? Less than 2 months. You know, they're out a couple of months, and Moses goes up on the mountain to get all the commandments and laws from God. And what's Aaron doing down there? Building a golden calf because Moses didn't come back. Right. And I have no idea how that got broken, Mom. Yeah. But what I'm saying is Israel has always been prone, in their history, was always prone to idolatry. And God, again, is warning them about this. See, we often tend to connect idolatry with Jeroboam. Okay? Well, at least if you're familiar with the Old Testament names, you are. After Solomon, the king, you had Rehoboam, and the kingdom split, and you had the two Boams. You had Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Okay? It was Jeroboam that introduced idolatry, and all of the kings of the north after that followed idolatry. None of them ever served the Lord. The kings of the south were up and down. But, many times we tend to connect the idolatry of Israel with that era. What I want us to see as we go through and study Solomon is, in fact, the idolatry, all of that foundation was laid with Solomon. All of that was done under Solomon's time. And God here warned him, don't do it, and he did it anyway. But you have here, God appears to Solomon the second time, and it's primarily a warning. These warnings were foreshadowed by threats. I say threats. It wasn't vindictive threats, but if you go all the way back to Deuteronomy 29, Moses is admonishing the people, if you turn away from the Lord, this is what's going to happen. God's going to judge you in this way. Well, what God is telling Solomon here is pretty much the same thing. If you disobey, this is what's going to happen to you. Okay? So you have the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, but I want you to turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 7 with me for just a minute. Because there's a very familiar portion here in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 that falls in this context. Okay? In this context of God coming to Solomon the second time and saying, I'm going to bless this house and I'm going to answer your prayers, which Solomon basically said, God, would you let your presence be here? And if your people offer here or pray towards this house, would you hear it and answer? And God says, yes. And then God appears to him the second time. 2 Chronicles 7 verse 12. The Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said unto him, I've heard thy prayer and have chosen this place to myself for an house of sacrifice. If I shut up heaven that there be no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now mine eyes shall be open and my ears attent unto the prayer that is made in this place. Verse 17, as for thee, if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked. So it was in this context of God appearing to Solomon the second time that we get this very familiar passage. I would render an educated guess that most all of you have heard 2 Chronicles 7:14 before, probably several times. But that passage, if my people which are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, was spoken by God to Solomon in this context. In the context of this second appearance, the second dream, where God says, I've chosen this house, and if my people will turn to me, I will hear them. And then on the flip side, if you don't, I will judge you. Okay? So, anyway, just to kind of keep all of those things in perspective, this was not something that Solomon asked for, but rather something God volunteered. If my people which are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. God said it to Solomon in this context. I would love to bless you, Solomon. But if you turn away from me, this is what I will do in judgment. Okay? So then that brings us to Solomon's other building projects. All right, I'm going back to 1 Kings chapter 9 now. I told you we'd go back and forth a little bit between Kings and Chronicles. 1 Kings chapter 9 in verse number 10. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years. See, we're picking the story back up. This is kind of what I told you. The Eastern historians sometimes didn't always put it in sequential order like we would. It says in verse 1 of chapter 1 and 2 that it was after he'd finished building the king's house and the Lord's house and all these projects. Well, the first part of the chapter kind of deals with the Lord's house and God appearing to Solomon, and the rest of this, verses 10 through 19, deal with the other things that Solomon built. It came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, verse 11. Now Hiram king of Tyre had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees and with gold, according to all his desire, that then Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Now, we won't turn back, but if you go back to 1 Kings 3, 4, and 5, when they made the original agreement, Solomon had said, I will give the hire for your workers. So it seems like maybe this was the pay for the workers and the materials and so forth. That's my educated guess. It may not be right, but that's my best guess. Verse 12, Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. And he said, What cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Kabul unto this day. And Hiram sent to the king 60 talents of gold. All right, now that's kind of just a little interesting footnote. There's another indication in Chronicles that, maybe Solomon took them back and gave him money instead, but just kind of a little interesting there in the middle of this, but it's talking about the building projects. Verse 15, and this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised. For to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and Millo, and the walls of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh king of Egypt had gone up and taken Gezer, and burned it with fire, and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, and given it for a present unto his daughter, Solomon's wife. And Solomon built Gezer, and Beth-horon the nether, and Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness in the land, and all the cities of store that Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots and horsemen, and that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, and in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. So this is kind of the summary of all the building projects that Solomon had going on. Okay? But what you see here in verse 15, he built up the house of the Lord and his own house, and Millo and the wall of Jerusalem. That word Millo kind of means to fill in. It has the idea of a fortification. But a lot of the commentators would say, and I think this makes the most sense, that this would be when Solomon kind of expanded the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem of David had a certain footprint, and what we would call the Temple Mount or the Mount Moriah was outside the wall at that point. Well, Solomon kind of expanded the wall of Jerusalem and included the Temple Mount and expanded that area out a little bit more. But Millo means fortifications, and it's not necessarily one fort or tower. It could be kind of a collective idea. So you have Millo. Well, then you have Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Okay, now Gezer was not an old folks' home. All right, it wasn't. I just had to get that out there so Pastor Stevens could concentrate. He was going to say that if I didn't. So, all right. But what was this? Well, Hazor was a town in the north of Palestine. All right. Megiddo was in central Palestine, and then Gezer was in the south, which makes sense. If Pharaoh had come up from the south and captured it and burnt it, then that would have been on the southern part of the land of Israel, closest to Egypt. But basically what you see here with Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer was fortifications for the main access points if Israel were going to be attacked. Hazor was in the north, kind of right on the path from if an army landed with boats at the harbor, and then they were going to take a land path into Israel. Hazor was right on the main travel route. Megiddo, same idea, in central. If they landed further down the Mediterranean and tried to come into north or central Palestine, then Megiddo was right there on the plain of Jezreel. Does that name at least ring a bell, even if you couldn't put your finger on it on a map? Well, if you go and look at Daniel and Revelation, you talk about Megiddo and Jezreel and this and that. This is right in the central part of Palestine where a lot of future prophetic events will happen. And then, of course, Gezer was we're told here in the text that Pharaoh, verse 16, took it from the Canaanites. So it was a city where at one time Israel had not driven out the Canaanites yet, but Pharaoh conquered it and burned it with fire. But that would have been a strategic defense point if enemies were coming from the south. So what you have here with these three cities is a military fortification on the main travel routes, north, central, and south in the land of Palestine or in the land of Israel. Okay? And then you see verse 17, Gezer and Beth Horon the Nether. That would be areas in that same region helping to fortify the place. And then the other places, Balath, Tadmor. But these are areas where Solomon was building up fortifications. Verse 19, you see he had cities for chariots and horsemen and cities of store. Now, what were the cities of store? I think the cities of store refers to basically Solomon's laying up treasures against potential problems. You remember what Joseph did in Egypt? When God said there's going to be times of famine, what did they do? They laid up storehouses, and then when the famine came, they had supply to keep people alive. It was somewhat like that. Could be some degree of the king's treasures being stored there. But you have his cities for his horsemen and chariots. We'll talk more about that in chapter 10. That's dealt with a little bit further down. And his house in Jerusalem and in Lebanon. Where was Lebanon in relation to Jerusalem? North. Okay. So in other words, that Jerusalem was his everyday house. Lebanon was his mountain house. He had a house in the forest of Lebanon. Well, I mean, that was his mountain house. It was nice and cool up there. It was a desert climate, in the lower areas of Israel. So he had his mountain house, and we're told in chapter 6, 7, and 8, when it's talking about the building of the house of the Lord, that the house of the forest of Lebanon, Solomon built with a lot of the same design elements as was in the house of the Lord and the king's house. Okay? So you have Solomon's other building projects. So you remember all of those loggers and all of those stonemasons and all that? They weren't necessarily all building the temple at once. Some of them were working on other projects, I think. But once they got done on the temple, then he shifted them over to these other projects, I'm sure. So you have his building projects, and then we have Solomon's workforce in verses 20 through 25. All the people that were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and all the other ites, which were not of the children of Israel, their children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel were not able to utterly destroy, upon those did Solomon levy a tribute of bondservice unto this day. What does that unto this day mean? Does that mean until March the 20th, 2022? Exactly. It was still going on at the time of the writing of 1 Kings. Okay? So 1 Kings is being written from a more of a historical perspective, but all of those leftover Canaanites, the groups that had not been utterly destroyed, they were made bondservants. That was Solomon's workforce. You see the same thing mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter number 8. But he made bondservants of all of those people. Verse 22, but of the children of Israel did Solomon make no bondmen, but they were men of war, and his servants, and his princes, and his captains, and his rulers of his chariots, and his horsemen. So the more prominent positions went to the citizens, the Israelis. And the other bondservant work was assigned to the leftover Canaanite groups that were still in the land. Verse 23, these were the chief of the officers that were over Solomon's work, 550, which bear rule over the people. Verse 24, Pharaoh's daughter came up out of the city of David unto her house, which Solomon had built for her. Then did he build Millo. Okay? So you have Solomon's workforce. Well, then you have, right in the middle of this section, you have a description of the house that was built for Pharaoh's daughter. You see the same thing mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 8. Now, In 1 Kings chapter 3, we see the same thing. When Solomon took Pharaoh's daughter to wife, it says in chapter 3, verse 1, Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, took Pharaoh's daughter, and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall of Jerusalem. So that lines up with the timeline we've been talking about in chapter 9, right? He built the Lord's house and Solomon's house, and he fortified Jerusalem. Well, until that time, Pharaoh's daughter lived there. Well, then he gave her her own house, which I think was probably in Gezer, which Pharaoh had conquered and then given to Solomon as a present, so to speak. Well, then Solomon built a house for Pharaoh's daughter there. Okay? But if you would, look with me. There's a very interesting statement in the Chronicles passage. You still got a finger or a bookmark in Chronicles. Look in 2 Chronicles chapter 8 for just a minute. The first part of chapter 8 is a almost carbon copy of what we just read about the workers and the officers. Verse 11 of chapter 8, 2 Chronicles 8, verse 11. Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David unto the house that he had built for her. For he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel. That's interesting, isn't it? Now notice the reason. For, he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. So why couldn't his wife live there if those places were holy? Well, for one, she was Egyptian, and that was a marriage that God had told them not to make. But for two, we're going to see later on that Solomon eventually built a house of worship for the gods of his wife, who was Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, in Solomon's lifetime, he built an idol temple and all of that for them, and then some of the other wives are like, hey, I want it for mine too. Before Solomon's death, he had built these other houses for the worship of false gods. I think this is a preview right here of the fact that his wife, Pharaoh's daughter, was there, but she was not on board with all of this temple and the house of Jehovah and all of that worship. So he decided the best thing to do was to kind of move her out of the city of Jerusalem. You know what this is right here? This is the seeds of downfall. Okay? This is the beginning of a path to exactly what God was warning about when he appeared to him in a dream the second time, right? If you obey me, I'll bless you, but if you follow idols, I will judge you. Well, guess what? I mean, this is kind of a hint at what's going to come later on down the line, but you see there he had made a house for Pharaoh's daughter, all right? Now, we can stay here in 2 Chronicles chapter 8. The next thing in both Kings and Chronicles is the offering of the sacrifices. Verse 12, Solomon offered burnt offerings unto the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the porch, even a certain rate every day, offering according to the commandment of Moses on the Sabbaths and the new moons and the solemn feasts, 3 times in the year, even in the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, and the feast of tabernacles. Those were the 3 times where the law of Moses said that all the males were supposed to come and appear before the Lord. Verse 14, and he appointed, according to the order of David his father, the courses of the priests. But you see Solomon's sacrifices here. In other words, Solomon made a provision for the daily sacrifices. If you were to go back into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you would see that there was a morning and evening sacrifice that was to be offered every day on behalf of all the people. On the Sabbath, there was the regular daily sacrifices, and then there were extra sacrifices. And on the new moon, which was once a month, there were special sacrifices. There was the regular ones and the Sabbath and the new moon sacrifice. So if you add it all up, it was a fairly significant number of animals in a month that would be offered as sacrifices. I mean, 2 a day plus extra ones for the Sabbath plus the new moon. I mean, you're talking about, at least 50 animals probably? Could have been more. But Solomon had made provision. So basically he provided the sacrificial animals or provided money for those. Now, where do you think that came from? Taxes. Okay, he was receiving tax revenue, but he provided for the sacrifice of the people. And then when it says here that 3 times in a year he offered, that's the similar statement that you see in the 1 Kings account. It doesn't mean that was the only time Solomon ever offered a sacrifice, but it means he was following the law. The 3 times in a year where it specifically said all the males were to come and all Israel was to appear before the Lord, which unleavened bread, which was a time of Passover, and then Pentecost, which was the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which was right after the Day of Atonement. He offered special sacrifices at those times of the year as well. Okay, so you see Solomon's sacrifices mentioned here. And then if we go back to, we'll stay here in 2 Chronicles, verse 17. Then went Solomon to Ezion-Geber and to Eloth at the sea in the seaside, in the land of Edom. And Huram sent him by the hands of his servants ships and servants that had knowledge of the sea. And they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and took thence 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. All right. Now the parallel passage at the end of 1 Kings 9. King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is beside Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea. So over there we're told which sea, the Red Sea, not the Mediterranean, in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent in the navy. Now if you notice 1 Kings it says Hiram, which is what we've been accustomed to. 2 Chronicles it says Huram. It's the same guy. 2 different spellings of the same name. Okay? Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea, and they came to Ophir. Okay, and fetched gold, which the gold of Ophir in the time of Solomon was considered the best, purest, most valuable gold. So you have here Solomon's navy. Ezion-Geber was in the land of Edom. In relation to Israel, where was the land of Edom? East and south. So that puts it basically right in what we would call the Sinai Peninsula, more or less, in that general region. Eloth, which is a city that's mentioned here, the commentators equate to modern Aqaba, which is on the Gulf of Aqaba. You're like, yeah, I know right where that is. All right, let me show you. You know the map where you recognize the Red Sea because of the rabbit ears? Okay, the right-hand side, right here, this is the Gulf of Aqaba. So it was right up in here, in this section on the Gulf of Aqaba, where Solomon built this navy. Now he had access to the Mediterranean Sea on the western border of Israel. Why would he want to go there? All right, well, let's zoom the map out a little bit. Okay, where's Israel? Israel is right here, where the red dot is, and this is the Mediterranean. Okay, so you have access to the Mediterranean, and if you go around Italy and around northern Africa through this strait right here, you know what this is over here? Come on. Atlantic Ocean. Okay? So through the Mediterranean, they had access to the Atlantic Ocean. But he actually built, this navy was launched somewhere right along in here from the ports that the land of Edom have. Well, if you come down the Red Sea all the way around this way, this is the the Arabian Sea, which then dumps into the Indian Ocean. What does he have access to from that direction? All of what we would call today the Middle East, all of India, China, and points to the Far East. So now, with Solomon having access to the Mediterranean to the west and the Red Sea to the southeast, well then he has access to the Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic and also India and the Indian Ocean as far as he wanted to go. Okay? So this was a strategic location. Now, we'll come back to this next week, but the Queen of Sheba, best we can tell, was from this area right here, modern-day Yemen. Now, the historian Josephus connects it with the other side of the Red Sea over here in what would have been Ethiopia. But either way, the Queen of Sheba was from a land that was right on the Red Sea, which had a lot of trade in gold, silver, and spices, which the spices, a lot of those came from the direction of what we call today India to the Far East. Okay? So, when we see here in the summary that we would sometimes tend to just kind of buzz over, oh yeah, he built ships and navy and whatever, just remember that the easiest access would have been here because Israel had coast up and down the Mediterranean Sea. But by launching a navy here and sending the ships out this way, Solomon had access to an entirely different part of the world. Gold, silver, spices, and all of that. So, has God fulfilled to Solomon what he promised him? Yes, he promised him that he would bless him, that he would make his name great. And the Queen of Sheba, which, if it's down in this region here, we're looking at a very zoomed out version of a map right here. Okay, that's 1,000 miles or more by camel or chariot. That was a long way away. But you see, in kind of a summary fashion, how God has kept His promise to Solomon to build up his fame and all of that. Now, what was God's purpose for doing that? Was it, to make him, wealthy and prosperous and all of that for its own sake? No, the purpose was that would be a light and a testament to the world. But what happens when he gets to that point? Solomon then begins to get distracted and bored. You read in the book of Ecclesiastes, I tried this, I tried that, I tried this, I tried that, I tried everything, I was bored. Okay? Solomon did not handle it well. Okay? Solomon made his choice. What's the application for you and me? We need to ask God to help us to handle equally well blessings as trials. Solomon here, we're seeing kind of the build up to the height of his kingdom. You see in verse 28, 420 talents of gold. That's tons of gold right there that were brought to him every 3 years. Tremendous amount of money. But he was expected to use it in the way that... But notice what God did. God knew the temptation that was going to come to Solomon, and He prepared him for it. Are you listening? Not to that specifically, but are you listening when the Lord's trying to get your attention and mine? The Lord knows what the potential stumbling points are, and He is trying to warn us and fortify us and prepare us ahead of time. Thank the Lord for His mercy. All right, we got to quit there for today. Thank you, Lord, for your word. And I pray that you'd help us to learn both from your blessings and from your warnings. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us to serve you, follow you equally in times of blessing as in times of trial. Lord, now we pray for the preaching hour to come, that you'd speak to our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.